Thank you, John. It's a great pleasure to be back, we might say, on this stage again. It was a few years ago that I was here last and updated our community on the research that my team has been involved in. And so I thank Sunny and everybody who made this possible. And I thank you for coming. I look forward to sharing results with you. I will tell you, as I prepared this talk today, thinking about all of the findings that our group has produced over the last few years since I was here, I ended up with 430 slides and a talk that would last 4 hours. And much as I would love to give you that talk, and you might even enjoy that talk in small doses, given that we have a limit, I'll share with you just a few findings from our work that I hope you'll find interesting and intriguing in light of recent events. In particular, my goal today is to, first of all, give you a quick update on the portrait of public opinion we've been building over 20 years. And I'd like to just say up front, I could go much more slowly and walk you through the methodology of our surveys and what we've been finding on a wide array of measures. So if you want more information than I'm able to provide today, I invite you to visit the webpage climatepublicopinion.stanford.edu. climatepublicopinion.stanford.edu. There are lots of lectures online there dating back many years that will provide you with insights into how we've done our work and what we found. But also, we're very excited to be very soon launching a brand new website that we've been working on for a long time that puts together all of our 20 years of survey data in one place in a way that is nowhere yet available. And that will also be on that site, so you can see that as well. But what I want to do is to update you to start with on where public opinion is as best we know now from our measurements, and put that in the context of some history. And then I want to talk about a psychological hypothesis of great interest for decades, especially to social psychologists, which is the notion of motivated reasoning. And this is an idea that has come into the climate change arena with great enthusiasm. The notion here is, in short, we see what we want to see, not what is in the world around us. And if we don't want to see something, we don't see it. So we have explored that hypothesis in a number of ways with a number of data sets, and I think produced findings that, at least for me, are quite intriguing and surprising. So I'll share that with you today. I will also give you some bites of dessert afterwards so that you can have a few miscellaneous findings that I think are also quite intriguing to give you a sense of where this issue may move in the future. So to start with, a portrait of public opinion. And let me also just insert the following request. I have been instructed to ask you please to hold your questions until the question period at the end of the talk. So I will ask you not to interrupt me, and if you do interrupt, I'll ask you to hold your question until later. I hope that's okay. So let's begin. What do Americans think? I just want to show you a couple of quotes of claims that people sometimes make. You may have seen these before. Here's one. The question was asked, why don't Americans believe in global warming? Asked The Economist, obviously a respected publication, in February 2011. Or in 2012, the public has caught on and believes the global warming issue is dead, came from Senator James Inhofe. And so these are obviously claims about public opinion. And at least for me personally, the way I would want to evaluate the veracity of these claims is by looking at objective, scientifically collected and properly analyzed survey data of the American public. And we've been doing surveys of that sort since 1997 and dating to 2015. Our most recent survey done at the very beginning of the last calendar year. We're just gearing up to do the 2016 survey. So I have no results to tell you yet because we haven't collected those data. In all of the surveys I'll tell you about, these are representative samples of American adults. And that has a very particular technical meaning. It means that every American has a known non-zero probability of being sampled for the survey. These are not surveys that involve people volunteering to do surveys for money. These are truly random samples of the American adult population, all interviewed by telephone. We call landlines and cell phones and do sophisticated statistical weighting of the data to produce representative samples that generalize to the population. We work hard at writing unbiased, balanced questions so as to avoid artifacts caused by wording that pushes respondents in a particular direction. And to begin with, I want to show you results in three categories of what I'll call the fundamentals. Has warming been happening? Has it been caused by humans? And is it a threat? And as you can imagine, there's no reason to talk about public attitudes toward, let's say, government intervention if there is no problem. If there's nothing to be solved, there's no need to look into solutions. So people need to believe it's happening, they need to believe it's caused by humans, and they need to believe it's a threat in order for there to be a logical basis for them to then say government ought to do something about it. So here's the wording of one of the survey questions that we've asked. It says, what's your personal opinion? Do you think that the world's temperature probably has been going up over the past 100 years, or do you think this probably has not been happening? So this is an example of a balanced question. It's written in a particular way that references a 100-year time period. We could have used a different time period, but at the time we wrote the question, natural science experts advised us that that was the most sensible time period to use. And if you think for just a moment about what results you might expect to see from the American public with a question like this, I will now show you what we have seen. So here we're dating back from 1997 through the most recent survey in January of 2015. And these are obviously gigantic numbers of people saying they think the Earth's temperature probably has been warming over the past 100 years. In the most recent survey, 69%. The earliest survey, 77%. There are these little whiskers here. These are error bars, the 95% confidence interval on each of these estimates. And you can see that there are significant ups and downs over this time period. And in a minute, I'm going to make a prediction about what the next bar is going to look like in 2016. But the key takeaway point here is that despite lots of things happening during this time period, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, Al Gore's movie, the economic recession of 2008, 2009, and so on. Lots of things have happened, and this particular belief in its distribution in the American public hasn't changed much at all. The signal being sent to government by these results is quite consistent. And as a little footnote, for those of you who are paying attention to the fact that there has been a surge of controversy during the last few years about the concerns regarding replicability of scientific findings across many fields. This is a great example of how you can do the same survey asking the same question many times and you get pretty much the same results over and over again. We also asked people a question about if nothing is done to address it, do you think the Earth's temperature will increase over the next 100 years? And this graph puts together answers to those two questions. This is the percent of people who said either the Earth has been warming or it will warm. And as you can see, there's tremendous consistency in those numbers during the time period that both of those survey questions were asked. Again, gigantic numbers. Now, you'll notice this is NOAA's land and ocean temperature. They call it anomalies. For those of you who are experiencing this, you know this is essentially their best guess of how temperature on average has changed across the years. And what you can see is this is the time period that some folks refer to as the pause. This is 2015. As you can see, there was a surge of the Earth's temperature hitting a record high. If you look here, you'll see this is 2010. And 2010 at that point was the warmest year on record, 2011 being an unusually low temperature year for that time period. And if you look back at these numbers, you'll see that following that record year in 2010, public opinion went up a bit. And following that cool year in 2011, public opinion went back down. This movement happens exclusively among people who don't trust natural scientists. That's about 1/3 of the country. They, as you know, during this time period, the messages from the natural science community, from the IPCC and others, didn't change. But the signal that the low trust people trust, which is those temperatures I just showed you, did change, and they reacted accordingly. Therefore, my prediction here today, and I have no data with which to cheat, is that this number is going to go up notably when the survey is done in 2016, because as you know, this 2015 high temperature has received its typical January publicity from NOAA. When we ask people, do you think do you think if the Earth's temperature has been warming during the last 100 years, do you think it's mostly due to things people have done, mostly due to natural processes, or about equally due to things people have done and natural processes? The percent of people pointing to human activity has been, again, extraordinarily high. Now, that's a question asked with a hypothetical. if the Earth's temperature has been warming, and we asked it that way because there's no reason why we want to constrain people's answers to this question based upon their belief about whether it's been occurring, but we can put these two together. This is now the percent of people who say the Earth has been warming and it's been caused at least somewhat by human activities. And again, you'll see no real notable change there, about 2/3 of Americans over this time period expressing that point of view. Now, obviously, it goes without saying that people might consider warming a problem even if they don't believe it's caused by human activity. So there's no need for these percentages to trump the others earlier. But here's a particularly important and interesting one. When we set out to do these surveys in the 1990s and talked to natural science experts, they advised that we ask about sort of what they consider to be the high end of potential warming, 5 degrees Fahrenheit over a 75-year period. When we asked people whether they thought overall, if that occurred, that would be good, bad, or neither good nor bad, as you can see, about 2/3 of Americans said they thought it would be bad, and that number has held constant over this period of time. So again, if you have that hypothesis that many do seem to endorse, that extreme weather events are what will cause people to recognize the threat of climate change, there certainly have been plenty of extreme weather events over this time period, and people's belief about the damage likely to be caused hasn't budged much at all. So that suggests some pause, I think, about that hypothesis. Now, as you may know, there have been assertions made that certainty about the opinions I just described to you is an important regulator of everything to follow in this talk. And an important source of this hypothesis is a book and a movie. You may have read the book, you may have seen the movie of the same name, Merchants of Doubt. The assertion being made here is a very interesting and provocative and reasonable one, that during the 1960s, 70s, and subsequently, the tobacco industry was committed to causing hesitation in the American public, whipping up uncertainty about statements that the U.S. Surgeon General made in the 1960s about the health risks of cigarette smoking. The assertion being made here is that it was the goal of the tobacco industry to say, wait, you know, we don't know for sure. In order to know for sure whether smoking is dangerous to human health, we would have to randomly assign humans to smoke or not smoke and then look at what the effects are. And of course, that would be the experimental design with the most internal validity. That hadn't been done, and therefore we don't know for sure. And that, you know, from a scientific point of view, that's a legitimate claim to make. It doesn't necessarily stand in the way of reaching conclusions, but it is a legitimate claim to make. And at that time, this argument goes that as long as uncertainty about the scientific evidence could be maintained, that could stave off regulations that might limit profit-making ability of the industry. And the same assertion has been made with regard to climate change, that industries that stand to lose their profit-making ability, if there are regulations of greenhouse gas emissions, might have an interest in whipping up uncertainty in the public, and there is some evidence that such industries have been making such efforts. So has it been successful? Has it been the case that over recent years, the public's certainty in their opinions has declined? Well, here's some evidence. This is just one arbitrary cut. That what we've done is to ask people, after we ask them, do you think the Earth has been warming or not, we ask them how sure they are about that, and they answer on a rating scale. These are the percent of people at the top 2 points, extremely or very sure. We could cut it lots of different ways. You would see the same basic story. As you can see, starting at 43% in 1997, at 44% in 2013, a bit lower at 39% most recently, there's not a dramatic downfall in certainty. However, if you just cover up the left side of this graph and just begin here in 2011, 53, 49, 49, 44, 39, you'd say, oh, that looks like a decline in certainty. That looks like maybe exactly what the Merchants of Doubt are purportedly trying to accomplish. That looks like supportive evidence, except it's not. Let me show you why. What I've done here is now to divide the public up into two groups. The green are the people who said they believe climate change has been happening. The purple are the people who said they think climate change has not been happening. I apologize for the complexity of the graph, but I'll explain it to you so you can understand it right now. The key point here is look from 2011 on. This is the time period we care about. And look first at these green bars. they're not moving. The certainty of people who believe climate change has been happening has not declined. So it's not the case that people have held to their belief it's probably happening, but they're less and less sure. Look where the decline in certainty happened. It happened in the purple bars from here to here. It's the people who believe climate change is probably not happening who became less certain over those years. So this is exactly the finding opposite to what the merchants of doubt were trying to accomplish. And in fact, it suggests that as scientific certainty has risen slightly over that time period, perhaps a new announcement of more findings and another IPCC report, that has in fact made the doubters less certain themselves. So just to show you kind of the lack of change, here we're looking at the percent of people, again, at the top 2 points in certainty, who believe warming has been happening and they believe it's been caused by humans. That group has remained very constant over time. And here are the skeptics. I'm now going to show you the people who say it's not happening and they're very sure of it. Tiny, tiny group. And they have not been growing over time. It's a loud group, but it's not a big group. Most importantly, the merchants of doubt argument has been that public confidence would be decreased by compromising trust in scientists. It has not happened, as you can see. This is the percent of people in these surveys who say that they trust the things that natural scientists say about global warming. So despite concerted efforts over this time period, perhaps, to reduce public trust in climate scientists, there has been no precipitous decline in that confidence. Now, I have told you, of course, that there is uncertainty. It is not the case that the American public is both overwhelmingly believing climate change is happening and they're completely sure of it. And as you can imagine, it's not at all unreasonable for people to hesitate, that they can only answer questions about what's happened over the last 100 years based on what natural scientists tell them and other information they can gather on their own. This is a hard question. And certainly, scientists have been wrong about lots of things in the past. They might be wrong about this. But the goal of the merchants of doubt, according to that argument, is that if you can maintain uncertainty, you can hold the public off from demanding government action. That the default is, if you're not sure we've got a problem, then we shouldn't take action. Only when people are sure will they ask government to step in. So is it the case that uncertainty is a barrier to support for government intervention? The answer is no. So first of all, this is the percent of our survey respondents who said they think the federal government should do more to deal with global warming. This is about 2/3 of the country, and it has held steady over this time period. These are some brand new findings. We've gotten into looking in particular at President Obama and the Congress. We've asked people about how important Americans think this issue is to the president and how important it should be to the president. And the key here is that about half of the country say that the president ought to attach a great deal of importance to the issue. It should be extremely or very important to him, but only 35% of people think it actually is that important to him. So there's a deficit there. Furthermore, I can show you that 43%, the plurality of Americans, want the president to increase the importance he attaches to the issue. 35% want him to keep it the same, and only 18% of the country want him to attach less importance to the issue, obviously on the basis of the assumption that the more importance he attaches to it, the more of a priority it is in his policymaking efforts. This is true for Congress as well. When we look at congressional Democrats, whereas Americans say 52% of Americans say that this issue of climate change ought to be extremely or very important to congressional Democrats, only 25% think this is so. Again, a deficit. The plurality think the congressional Democrats ought to increase the importance of the issue. Only 14% say it should be decreased, and 36% say it should be kept the same. When we look at congressional Republicans, 52% of Americans say it should be extremely or very important to them. And as you can see, Americans recognize that the issue is less important to Republicans in Congress than it is to Democrats in Congress. Only 11%, so a much larger deficit of importance in this regard. So here a majority, 56% want the Republicans to increase the importance they attach to the issue, and only 7% asking that it be decreased. When we look at the relative importance to the parties in Congress, what you can see is that 75%, fully 3/4 of Americans, say the issue should be equally important to both parties, and only 13% say it should be more important to Democrats than Republicans, and 11% say it should be less important to Democrats than Republicans. Again, when we look at the parties in Congress, that 42% say it is more important, and only 46% say it's equally important to both. So let's just go back here. 75% say it should be equally important, and only 46% say it is equally important. So again, another way of looking at the deficit. Here's an interesting question. We asked people during the past year, do you think that President Obama did more during the past year than he did during the 2 years prior to that, did less during that time period, or did about the same? So here we've got the survey in January 2015. We're asking, in 2014, did he do more, less, or the same as compared to the 2 years prior to that? Now, if you've been paying attention to the White House, you know he did a lot more in 2014 than he did during the prior 2 years. Only 16% of Americans recognize that. So as much as he devoted effort to addressing the issue, you might say there was a deficit of publicizing it broadly. Now, you can certainly imagine some people would say, yeah, I know what he did, but it's as close to zero as it was before. That may be their personal opinion, but you can certainly imagine an argument could have been made that these folks were missing something that actually happened, and whose responsibility was it to publicize that? Probably the White House. Okay, so you've seen now something about desired effort and perceived effort. Let's now shift into this policy arena and ask about specific policies. So first of all, a very general question. Do you think the federal government should limit greenhouse gas emissions by U.S. businesses? Now, before I show you this result, bear in mind, this is obviously, like many, many questions before the federal government, one that essentially says, should the hand of government interfere with the free market? And in this case, you might imagine that Republicans would be particularly uncomfortable with this idea, and we might therefore see this issue look much like we see many other controversial issues where the country is split 50-50. In fact, here's the question that we asked. As you may have heard, greenhouse gases are thought to cause global warming. In your opinion, do you think the government should or should not limit the amount of greenhouse gases that U.S. businesses can put out? The percentage saying yes is 78%. You cannot get 78% of the American public saying anything without lots of Democrats, lots of independents, and even a good portion of Republicans as well. These are a series of policies we've been asking about since 2006, whether the federal government should require or encourage businesses to do the following: lower greenhouse gas emissions by power plants, CAFE standards being strengthened, requirements for more energy efficient buildings or appliances, and building all electric vehicles. You'll see the support for these policies started in excess of 80%. They end up most recently around 70%. The least popular of these particular policies is all electric vehicles. We have yet to look into that and what explains lower enthusiasm for it, but you can easily imagine that it is the deficit the country currently offers in terms of the distance those cars can travel and the absence of battery changing stations all across the country that could be parallels to gasoline filling stations that are everywhere. So once the technology catches up, perhaps people would be more positive. But there's another possible explanation, perhaps, that we haven't thought of, and we look forward to investigating that. We've asked about carbon taxes charged to businesses for emissions. We've asked about it in multiple different ways. Here, if we asked about taxing businesses on the carbon emissions that they are responsible for, without any mention of what happens to the tax money. 61% of people said they supported that in our most recent survey. When we added the caveat that the tax money would be returned to all Americans equally, so the government raises money by charging a tax, and then this is, of course, the cap and dividend, that tax and dividend idea, support goes up only a small amount to 67%. And again, we look forward to trying to understand what causes the differences here, but at the moment we can say about 2/3 of people support this type of carbon tax. Here, we focused instead on imported coal and natural gas and oil. That is, the more importing of fossil fuels a company is responsible for, the more of a tax they would pay. Again, about 2/3 of Americans supporting that idea, and we see no real notable change provided by refunding the tax money to consumers. When we asked a series of questions about tax incentives, the most popular of these, offering tax breaks to utilities to produce more electricity from water, wind, and solar. That number started off at 87% in 2006. It is at 80% most recently. A bit less popular, reducing air pollution from burning coal through carbon sequestration is about 2/3 of Americans supporting that. Still less popular is the use of nuclear power, which has been declining over time. And the least popular are two policies on imposing taxes on people's consumption of gasoline and electricity. And let me tell you how those questions are phrased. Do you think the federal government should increase the taxes on gasoline in order to cause people to use less of it? So it's obviously a question that's faithful to the economics policy of interest here, but it's also explicitly stated in a way that says government will reach in your pocket, take out some money every time you buy gasoline, which you will have to do, and I'm telling you nothing about what will happen to that money, and the only reason for reaching in your pocket is to manipulate you and others. So in order to support that policy, you've got to believe that actually that tax, which is an unstated amount in this question, will actually produce any measurable benefits, which is not guaranteed. So it's not so surprising, I think, that people are not particularly enthusiastic. I hope you will not make the mistake that some folks do when seeing this finding to say, aha, what this shows is people don't want to pay. It's not that. It's that they don't want to pay when the purpose is not guaranteed. When you say the assumption is raising the price, an unspecified amount will reduce consumption and emissions an unspecified amount. That's not a situation in which people are happily forking over money. And I'll show you some data on willingness to pay in a moment. When we asked about energy sources, requiring power companies to make at least 20% of their electricity from wind, water, and solar, you might remember this was one of the planks of one of the bills considered seriously by the Congress a few years ago. 69% said government should do this. Carbon sequestration, offering tax breaks to companies that burn coal if they use new methods to put the air pollution they generate into underground storage areas, 68% in favor of that. When we asked most recently about cap and trade in 2013 and 2015, you can see essentially the same patterns here, a little bit less than half here, a little bit more than half here in support of cap and trade. But when we tell people this is the tax and dividend, that the tax revenue will be returned to Americans equally, support goes up a bit. So tax and dividend maybe is in about the 2/3 range of support. Okay, let's take a breath for a moment. So what have you seen? You have seen evidence that very large majorities believe there's an issue here and that there's a threat, and support government action to address it, are not particularly aware of government action, and feel that government has been under-responsive on the issue in recent years. In some cases, being unaware of the action that actually has been taken. As you know, there are some counter-arguments made to these. One is that it would be a mistake to take these actions now because the effects of climate change won't be visible for many, many years, whereas the effects of interventions now to reduce emissions will cause pain now for us. And as you can see, a very small portion of Americans, less than 1/3 of Americans over this time period, said they thought the U.S. doing things to reduce global warming would hurt the U.S. economy. When we asked, do you think the things people would have to do to stop global warming would make your own life better, worse, or neither better nor worse? Again, the assertion here made by skeptics is that it's only going to cause pain now in order to gain later. In fact, only 14% of Americans accept that point of view in our most recent survey. In fact, the plurality of people think it will make their own lives better to be addressing emissions now. So that doesn't work. Also, as we've asked most recently, when looking backwards, do you think you personally have been hurt by global warming that's happened so far, helped, or neither? You know, you can certainly imagine, maybe there's some people in this room who would say they're actually benefiting from global warming because they own a solar panel installation company. And so in the short term, they're employed and gaining some revenue. Lots of possible reasons for people to think that they benefit. And so we wanted to, in an open-minded way, look at the possibility that people would think they might be hurt, they might be helped, and they might both be helped and hurt. And as you can see here, 34% of people believe they already have been hurt by global warming, and 9% believe they've been helped. 45% believe that it has hurt them more than it has helped them. And looking at the future, 54% believe they will be hurt personally, at least a moderate amount. Only 15% believe they'll be helped by it. And again, you can imagine this is not only solar panel installers, but folks who live in Alaska and would like a little less ice. And 55% say it will hurt more than it will help. So this is another way to look at the idea that maybe efforts to address this only involve costs in the short term and benefits in the long term. Americans don't seem to think that way. When we asked about whether global warming will hurt you personally over this time period, the figures are in about this 54 to 62% range. When we asked about the impact on future generations, it's very clear. 74% of Americans said they thought global warming will hurt future generations, and only 18% think it will help. And again, 68% saying it will hurt more than it will help. And no real notable change in the proportion who believe it will hurt future generations between 2009 and the present. Okay, so we've gotten that far. But another response from skeptics is, yes, okay, fine. People think it's happening, they think it's a threat, they don't think it's going to hurt to do something about it, but it's not a priority. Government, in the minds of Americans, should focus their attention on other issues, say the skeptics. Well, if you want to support that point of view, this is a great question to look at. It's been asked in many, many surveys over decades. What's the most important problem facing this country today? In our most recent asking of that question, among a wide variety of issues, the economy, maybe not surprisingly, comes in first place. Global warming and the environment come in tied for last place among the problems that we cited. You could say, well, there's evidence right there that it's not a priority for Americans. But if you look back at this question wording, you'll see it asks only about the most important problem, right, without allowing people to mention more than one problem. It asks only about this country, and it asks only about today. So we asked also a different question. What will be the most important problem facing the world in the future if nothing is done to address it? And when we did that most recently, you'll see global warming and the environment come in first place. So it's not the case that this is a low priority issue. You might want to argue that actually Americans are much more parochial than this implies, that they believe, look, it's hard enough for government to do anything, that let's just have government focus on our problems today rather than also trying to solve other people's future problems. So we asked this question: how much effort do you think the federal government in Washington should put into dealing with the serious problems the world will face in the future if nothing is done to stop them, and so on? And what we find is the proportion of people putting themselves at the top 2 points on this 5-point rating scale is 76%. So Americans are not so parochial as to be asking government only to focus on today's domestic problems. Which brings us to willingness to pay. Is it the case that Americans say all this stuff, but it's really cheap talk? They don't really mean it. When it comes down to it, they're not willing to fork over any money. So what we did in one case was to ask people this question: if the U.S. Congress were thinking of passing a law that would reduce the amount of air pollution that the country puts out by 85% by the year 2050, if that would cost your household an extra $150 in taxes every year on average, would you vote for this law or vote against it? This is an implementation of the technique called contingent valuation you may know about. And some respondents, those who were asked about $150, 58% of them said they would vote in favor of this policy. Now, this is an economically incentive-compatible question. In other words, there's no reason to say you would vote for this unless you support it. And what we did was to actually randomly assign some of the respondents to be asked about $150, as you see here, and other respondents were asked instead about $75. And so this is what psychologists would call a between subjects experimental manipulation. And if respondents are paying attention to the price, and the price goes down, what should happen to this number? Well, it might go up, right? People might be more willing to buy it if they want the good. Now, if I ask you, how much would you like to pay me to put a needle in your arm? Just because I reduce the price doesn't mean you're willing to say, yeah, do it. But the fact is that this number does go up from 58% to 66%. Among the people who are randomly assigned to be asked instead about $250 when the price goes up, if some people's maximum willingness to pay is somewhere between $150 and $250, this number will go down. And in fact, it does to 41%. And when you put these numbers together using what's called a turnbull willingness to pay calculation, that you're able to, with a very strong downward bias, generate an estimate of the percent of people willing to pay at least each of these dollar amounts on the right-hand side. I'm not going to walk you through this. I'm just simply going to tell you that when you multiply this out by 117 million households in America, we find that about $18 billion as a lower bound estimate is what Americans say they are willing to pay for that very specific greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So you know they're told what the benefit is, and they're told what the cost is, and they're given the opportunity to vote for it or against it. Now it just turns out that the EPA has said that's about what it would cost to produce that reduction. Now there's no reason why this should have matched. We didn't tell the respondents what the EPA said it would cost. In fact, we hadn't even looked up what the EPA said it would cost until after we did the survey. And so coincidentally, it looked like, as a collective, American willingness to pay meets the standard, at least according to the EPA. Okay. However, there is a very dramatic partisan gap on this issue. When we started studying this issue, there wasn't. There was no gap between Republicans and Democrats, but I'll show you this graph that comes from a recent publication looking at data from 2001 through 2010, and this is a question about the existence of warming, and as you can see, these are the Democrats up here. Their number's gone up from about 60% to about 70%. These are the Republicans here. Their number has gone down from 49% to about 29%. Why has this happened? Well, it shows up in our data as well. I'm just going to very quickly show you a series of slides. So this is the question about, has global warming been happening? Democrats higher than Republicans. Ooh, look at that. 61% of Republicans say it's been happening. That's interesting. Has human action been involved? Same difference. Would 5 degrees of warming be bad? Same difference. Will it be a serious problem for the US? Same difference. Should government do more? Same difference. Should businesses do more to deal with the issue? Same difference. Should average people do more? Same difference. Okay, so why? If you look at the literature on this phenomena, psychologists have become especially fascinated with it in recent years, and they have an answer. It is the idea of motivated reasoning that I described to you earlier. What social psychology says is that routinely we encounter the same information, but we evaluate it differently. So depending upon what you want to believe, what you want to see, what would make you happy, you'll see the same glass of water as half full or half empty. And in particular, the proposal here is that you will be more influenced by messages that are congenial for you. Messages that say what you want to hear will have impact. Messages that say what you don't want to hear will be subjected to scrutiny and rejection. That's the hypothesis. And there's lots of literature that has proposed evidence of motivated reasoning in many arenas. So if motivated reasoning operates in this arena, then first, encountering information that expresses a green viewpoint, and forgive me for using this term, this is just a shorthand term to refer to a conglomerate of beliefs. Climate change has been happening. It's been caused by humans, it poses a threat, government should do something, an array of opinions summarized in shorthand by the word green. So if, for you, encountering information that expresses a green viewpoint should be accepted readily by Democrats because it's presumably congenial for them, rejected by Republicans, and encountering information that expresses a not green viewpoint should be rejected by Democrats and accepted by Republicans. This is the motivated reasoning hypothesis. So we tested it in a couple of different studies. The first one here using the impact of what we call balanced news stories. So in this experiment, each participant is randomly assigned to one of 5 groups, a control group or 4 treatment groups. The control group sees no news story about climate change at all. The first treatment group sees a story about the existence of climate change, just simply saying the Earth has been warming. And it is a story that involves only an interview with a natural science expert. Group 2 sees the same natural science expert saying climate change has been happening, followed by an interview with a skeptic who says, nah, I don't think so. Group 3 sees instead a natural science expert talking about the likely consequences of warming. This happens to be Steve Schneider. And there is no additional skeptic following Dr. Schneider. And for Group 4, they see Steve talk about the likely consequences, followed by a skeptic saying, a greener world, a hotter world is a greener world is a healthier world. So kind of counteracting that same argument. So you can imagine looking at the design here as one that is assessing the impact of balancing a news story by adding the skeptic, comparing this group to this group and comparing this group to this group. Here we're going to say, well, does adding the skeptic have more impact on the people who like the message, that is Republicans, than Democrats? And does going from the control group to the groups that hear just the natural scientist, does that have the most impact on Democrats, those people who find it congenial? So how did we do this? Well, this is a non-probability sample of almost 3,000 American adults who signed up to do surveys for money. It's not a random sample of the American public. They all have computers and internet access, and they can watch videos on their computers. So that's definitely a subset of the American public, not the entire public. The procedure is one in which they watch the video, and then they answered a series of questions measuring their opinions. So the dependent measure in this experiment is an index, a series of questions that tap into what you might call green opinions. So do scientists agree that global warming has been happening? Has it been happening? Has human action been responsible? Would warming be bad? Will it be a serious problem? Should the federal government do more? And do you support cap and trade? So we just put all of these questions into a single index. Results look the same regardless of whether you break it up. And just to review, you are now comfortable, I'm sure, with these hypotheses, but here they are. People exposed to the green viewpoint in the video by a mainstream scientist will move in the green direction. And adding a skeptic may reverse or even eliminate the impact of the mainstream scientist. Not a surprising hypothesis. And what we found is that, sure enough, people who were exposed to the mainstream scientists were, in fact, more likely to express green opinions, statistically significantly so, and exposure to the skeptic almost completely eliminated the impact of the mainstream scientists. This number here, the minus 0.044, is about the same size as the plus 0.054, both of them statistically significant. But here's the interesting question. Did this happen mostly among Democrats, and did this happen mostly among Republicans who find the messages most congenial? So first of all, these are the numbers I just showed you, 0.054 and minus 0.044. So this is the impact of the mainstream scientist and the impact of the skeptic among all respondents. Now I'm going to separate them. What happens among, oops, sorry, what's happening here? Okay, yeah, let me just, so I've told you this already, so we will go here. So here, first of all, are the Democrats. So in response to the mainstream scientist, the Democrats are actually, there's no little asterisks up here like there are here. The Democrats are not significantly changed by exposure to that message, despite the fact that the hypothesis was the gray bar would be higher here, that the Democrats would find this message most congenial and it would impact them the most. In contrast over here, where the Democrats are exposed to the skeptic, they are essentially as influenced by the sample as a whole. You can guess already what's going to happen because the Republicans are the people who are essentially left out of this picture. When we add the Republicans, as it turns out, in order for this to be the average of that and that, this number has to be higher. The Republicans are substantially and significantly influenced by the mainstream scientists. So these are the people who we would have guessed would find the message least appealing, and yet it produces a larger change among them. It produces a change. And here, again, what we see is no difference between the Democrats and Republicans in their reaction to the skeptical message. This is not the picture suggested by the motivated reasoning hypothesis. Okay. In fact, you might say, interesting, maybe these are the people who have been least exposed to this message in the past. And simply creating that exposure is enough to produce change in that direction. So I can tell you, I'm just going to list these quickly. There are a series of hypotheses that we tested. The first one is unsupported. Any p's larger than 0.05 are rejection. And you can see that's a lot bigger than 0.05. Second hypothesis, unsupported. Third hypothesis, unsupported. Fourth hypothesis, unsupported. So and these P's are nowhere close to statistically significant. So unfortunately, the motivated reasoning hypothesis will now be taken to the emergency room. The conclusions are, we have lots of evidence of persuasion. Simply exposing people to a message changes opinions statistically significantly. And the second message, that balancing, completely eliminated, essentially, the impact of the first message. And since life often involves competing messages, real persuasion may be much less common than it seems to be in past lab studies, which have typically involved only presentation of a single message. In other words, lots and lots of social psychological experiments brought participants into a lab, exposed them to one message, and showed the finding that I showed you initially. That is, you can get people to move their opinions in that direction. But if they're in the real world and news media coverage balances various points of view, that balancing may eliminate any change that would have happened. Okay, second study along the same lines. Here we're looking at the impact of Fox News. So when people have been asked in surveys, this is an NBC Wall Street Journal survey from 2010, for the sources of the most information they get about politics, not surprisingly, Democrats, 93% of them say something other than Fox News, and 7% of them say Fox News, so that's interesting. And Republicans are split about equally between Fox and not Fox. So the key point of this picture is just to show you there is variation. It's not the case that Republicans are only watching Fox and Democrats are only not watching Fox. And we have the independents in the middle here who are a mixture as well. This is great for us analytically because we can now do something with this variation, as I'll show you. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that the content of Fox News is more skeptical about climate change. This has been published a number of times. So in our study, this is a national random digit dial telephone survey with 1,000 respondents. So this is a representative sample done in 2010. We asked two questions about media exposure. How many of the last 30 days did you watch Fox News? And how many of the last 30 days did you watch TV news other than Fox? So here, we're only focused on television news. Nonetheless, as you'll see, the findings are quite interesting. We again created an index of opinions, so you can see lots of different questions, like the ones I showed you earlier. This is our dependent measure. And just to give you a sense of the distribution that we found, because we didn't know of anybody else who had asked this 30-day question, among Democrats, there are some people who 30 out of the last 30 days had watched Fox News. There are enough people who've watched some Fox to give us some power, a relatively small group who hadn't watched any. And among Republicans, again, there's a spike of people who watch it every day and a spike of people who don't watch it at all and a distribution in between. So we can use those variations to test these hypotheses. The more Fox News exposure somebody has, perhaps the less likely they are to accept natural scientists' views of global warming. And the more not Fox News exposure they have, the more likely they are to accept scientists' views if you accept the idea that this coverage is dominated by scientists' views on the green side of the issue, and this coverage is more likely to be skeptical. And that's, in fact, what happens. So what you can see here, I've arrayed people from no days of Fox exposure to 30 days of Fox exposure. And these are lines that are imposed on the data, but the lines fit the data perfectly. So even though this cleans things up, this really is the story of what the data says. For many different measures, the more days of Fox somebody is exposed to, the more likely they are to express skeptical opinions on the issue. In contrast, this is number of days of exposure to not Fox News. The more days of that, the more green a person is. Now, you can certainly say, well, how do we know this is causal? It could very well be that people select Fox because they're skeptical, and that involves that reverse causation. Fine, it takes nothing away from the analysis I'm about to show you. So here we're going to look at, we've got regression coefficients estimating the impact of Fox and not Fox News on opinions. And these are the summary of those graphs I just showed you. So in other words, the more Fox exposure the full sample is exposed to, the less green people become. The more exposure to not Fox, the greener they become. I'm just going to simply split the data into Democrats and Republicans. Because remember, the prediction is Republicans will be more affected by Fox than Democrats will. Democrats will be more affected by not Fox than Republicans will. Republicans will be more affected by Fox than not Fox News. And Democrats will be more affected by not Fox than by Fox. So this is all just stating, again, the motivated reasoning hypothesis. Is it true? Well, first of all, the Fox News story we presumed would have less impact on Democrats. It does not. It's about the same as the sample as a whole. Not Fox exposure, we expected, would have more impact on Democrats than Republicans. In fact, that number is lower. This is not looking good. Here are the Republicans. The Republicans are actually less influenced by Fox than the others, and the Republicans are slightly more influenced than the Democrats by not Fox. Okay, so no support, again, for this one, or this one, or this one, or this one. So for those of you who've been reading closely the literature on scientific controversy and concerns about the replicability of results, one of the areas of concern for many scientists is a bias against the null hypothesis. The idea is that if you do tests like this and you fail to support what people expect you to find, you'll have a hard time getting it published. I hope that's not the case for us. I've shared it with you today. So again, no evidence of motivated reasoning. Why not? Well, people are apparently not, at least in this arena, driven to execute motivated reasoning and instead appear to be data-driven. That is, the people who are less exposed to a message in general appear to be more influenced by it, and more exposure to mainstream science seems to promote endorsement of the green perspective, whereas mainstream climate science is front and center to everyone in this room, perhaps, but not necessarily to all Americans. So you might say if you were in that treatment group and you saw Steve Schneider, it would have no impact on you. But that doesn't mean that's true for everyone in the country.
Can you wrap up real quick?
So what has caused the party divide? Well, what I would suggest to you is that it appears to be differential exposure rather than motivated reasoning. That is, that Republicans are, in fact, selecting to watch Fox more than Democrats are. So there's a difference in the dosages they get. And that may give you some sense of hope about the future if your goal is to see Americans move in a green direction. That is, yes, despite the fact that the country is drowning in news suggesting support for green points of view, that news has not found its way into everybody's thinking as maximally as it might. Okay, so let me wrap up then with the following remarks. First, thank you for your patience. Thank you for your engagement. I hope you found this interesting and illuminating. What I've shown you is not only how we as social scientists do surveys to track American public opinion and to try to do so as objectively as we can, but also to show you something about the replicability of those findings. In other words, it's not the case that repeating the same survey question produces radical shifts in the proportions of Americans giving answers. I think that should give you some confidence in the findings that I've shared with you. Furthermore, it does not look like we are in a situation where Americans are seeing the world that they want to live in. And if you just pause for a second and think about that hypothesis, we only see what we want to see. We don't see what's really in the world. If that were really true, wouldn't we all have been hit by a bus by now? I mean, that we're actually not that bad at perceiving the world around us. Like pretty much everybody's able to drive, and that that things go wrong on occasion. But the fact of the matter is, I think it may be that social scientists have particularly enjoyed portraying Americans and people more broadly as biased and driven by their desires, and it's a reasonable hypothesis. It's certainly reasonable to propose the idea that we're all happier thinking the world is the way we want it to be, rather than if we had to confront the reality that the world wasn't the way we wanted it to be. On the other hand, are we really that out of touch? And are we really working hard to try to create false images of reality around us? You could easily imagine that Darwinian natural selection would bump off the people who are not actually seeing the reality. And so my suggestion would be that, at least in this arena, the idea of motivated reasoning, the idea that folks who want to make the public greener are fighting against people's own desires to be denialists, I think may not be supported by this evidence. Thank you very much for your time.
So, John, thanks for that uplifting ending. I was a little bit worried up until the end. So we have time just for a few questions, and then we can move out to the social students. Sir.
I guess my question is, I think Steve Schneider had a range of delivery schemes in which he delivered information about climate change. And I was curious, have you guys thought about the means through which the climate change science is communicated can shift some of these a little bit differently? So if you have somebody who's more about the house is on fire and we're inside versus the more hopeful delivery of the message, have you guys looked at the variations in the way that they might respond to that?
Yeah, so the question for those who couldn't hear it, I think I'll see if I can faithfully capture what you said, is that, that at least Steve Schneider and certainly others have thought about many different ways of conveying messages about climate change and lots of other issues. Public health officials, for example, have been very aware of the idea that you can try to get people to not smoke cigarettes by scaring them. You can cause people to not smoke cigarettes by creating a sense of hope. You can cause people to not smoke cigarettes by giving them information about risk. There are many different ways of designing messages, and there are many different ways of delivering messages, and there are many different ways of targeting messages. So you might try to subdivide your audience into the people who would benefit most from information, other people who'd be most motivated by fear, and so on. There's lots of support for that idea in the basic psychological literature. We have not seen, we've not done work, and we have not seen work that has looked at the various different strategies and looked at ways in which there might be a differential impact. I will tell you, though, that we have done a little bit of this looking at messengers. We've done a little bit of research looking at the potential that meteorologists who are on television might be particularly effective at conveying messages to the public about climate change. And so you can imagine a weather reporter during a television news broadcast that says, gee, it's been hot. And you can also imagine one that says, gee, it's been hot, this is global warming, or even going farther. What we found is that when meteorologists cross the line and start talking about global warming instead of just describing the temperature, it actually backfires. And so this is a humbling case in which I think the assumption that just if people hear about this from people they trust, then of course it will have impact. And I think when you think for a moment about that example, when you think about meteorologists, do we trust them? What? Yeah. So, we can certainly carry umbrellas on days when we didn't need them. More importantly, are they climatologists or are they just meteorologists? And so there's every reason to imagine that what sounded maybe like a good hypothesis to start with ends up not being one in the long run.
Your question's great.
Were you able to categorize the results by age group and by income level? And did you notice any significant difference among those groups?
If you don't mind my asking, what do you expect, or why did you ask that question?
About my generation, about millennials. So I want to see what my generation thinks.
Okay. Very, very understandable of you. So yes, we have looked for demographic differences in various ways, and they are rarely big. So we've looked at the impact of age, gender, race, education, income, region of residence, and so on. And I can tell you that when we do see effects of age, what we see is that younger adults are more concerned about this issue than older adults are. And maybe that's understandable, that there's a sense in which younger adults will be around long enough to witness even more of the potential negatives. So there's no sense in, if anybody tells you, oh, the young generation is uninterested in this, that we don't see that. We see quite the opposite. And I'll just give you a hint that we have found a very interesting result that found its way onto the front page of the New York Times in 2015, involving the fact that Hispanics appear to be more concerned and more engaged in this issue than non-Hispanic whites. And Taylor Orth, who's here, is writing a paper on that topic with us, and so you'll see more details about this in the near future.
Last question.
Yeah, thank you for a superb talk. I'm with Citizens Climate Lobby, which, as you know, is lobbying for a revenue-neutral carbon fee and dividend with all money returned, just like you asked in your question. And we also follow Tony Leisewitz's work at Yale, and there's a big discrepancy between your results and his, and it was explained by him on a call that it was the way in which he's asked the question, which shows far less support in this large middle area where people just don't have an opinion. How do you address that?
Yeah, I would agree with the characterization that you just suggested, which is I think the most likely explanation, which hasn't been tested formally yet, is a difference in question wordings. And I would encourage you to look closely at the wording of the question the Yale group asked, look closely at the wording of the question we have asked, which will be on that webpage that I mentioned to you, and reach your own conclusions about which one you feel is on target.
I prefer yours.
Well, thanks again, John, for this well-done talk.